Hi folks, I'm Helix and this is my pre-BlizzCon look at World of Warcraft. I'm going to try break my rambling down into a few sections to look at how the game has moved on since when I started playing late vanilla and what I'd personally like to see changed or added. Who knows, some of these features may appear in the next expansion, which is rumoured to drop at BlizzCon, but I definitely think some of my thoughts could work well in future content. If you agree with any of the points I have, or you want to share some of your own, feel free to comment and I can potentially do a follow-up video. So first off, we have zones. Now, zones have changed a lot since the vanilla state of the game, and we're not just talking about their physical form, which of course changed a lot during Cataclysm, but we're also talking about how the zones are utilized and viewed. When I first started playing, I chose to play a Night Elf, and as any good Night Elf player knows, you start in Teldrassil, and then I moved on to zones such as Darkshore, Felwood, Ashenvale, Desolace, Feralus. Of course, that's not the order you do them in, but it gives you an understanding as zones that perhaps you've never visited before because you don't have to anymore. The zones are now pretty much dormant. You rarely visit them and they've got a low footfall. There are still people who are diehard and will level in these zones, but gone are the days when you'd have to level there, and you're missing that whole area, the whole scenery, the whole feel. You once had to go to Desolace to get a quest to do in Scarlet Monastery, and you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to mount up and take 10 to 15 minutes out of your day to travel from Darkshore to Winterspring because you forgot to pick up the flight point in the past. And yes, the ability to fly has a lot to answer for in the death of historic zones. I found that when the ability to fly was introduced to Azeroth, that the true immersive feel of the game was lost for a lot of players like myself who enjoyed leveling multiple characters. Flying is great. You can get from A to B at high speed, but when did speed overtake the appreciation of content? There are often complaints with new patches that content is completed too quickly, but at the same time, players complain that they have to use land mounts to take more than 5 minutes to travel anywhere. You kind of got to make your mind up with this. Do you A, want to complete the content really quickly by flying from quest point A to quest point B, or do you want to have to take your time and negotiate your way through mobs and maybe take a little bit longer? These days though, unless you're a completionist, pet battler or archaeologist, you're probably unlikely to visit a lot of the zones that I've mentioned in Kalimdor, and same goes for Eastern Kingdoms. There's so many zones there that you're most likely just going to fly over and ignore and not appreciate. Even home cities aren't used nearly as much as they once were, with a lot of folks just staying in Dalaran, if then travelling to Orgrimmar or Stormwind being the two favoured cities for the factions. So what would I suggest as a solution? Well, there's obviously no quick fix about it. The way people level and work their way to level cap has changed a lot. You can't take away flying it now. It's been introduced. It would be too much of a high risk thing to do for Blizzard. There would be too much of an uproar, I feel, if they took away flying. You can't force people to use their ground mounts, and they've kind of put themselves into the situation. Gone are the days though when a majority of players would be using the leveling process where you go from quest hub to quest hub. A lot of people now prefer to don their heirloom gear and grind dungeons, which is fair enough, but it does then see even more of a death to zones. One possible solution would be to adopt the leveling format used with Legion, in which you venture to any zone you want to start off with, and mobs will level to your particular level, so they'll scale to your level. I do actually believe that scaling of zones would introduce more footfall to zones that haven't been used to the same degree as they have in the past. It would introduce new players to these zones, which they've maybe never gone to before. There's also potential though to introduce events within zones. Say for example, the cultists in Silithis started summoning a world boss or a rare mob, or if you go up to the hinterlands, the trolls are maybe uprising and pushing their way to Hillsbrad. Events which players could work together to battle and, of course, be rewarded for. So Blizzard could then, in effect, learn a lot from games like Guild Wars 2 with regards to timed appearances of bosses and rare mobs in zones, the way they're tagged, and the loot you get for the amount of effort you put in for killing them. A system which is both popular and relevant to games at the moment. You kind of get out what you put in. So the more work you do, the more you'll get from it. And I think that's quite a good solution and quite a good system. So moving on to dungeons. It's kind of much like zones with dungeons. They've seen their footfall evolve dramatically. Once upon a time, it would have taken time to find a party to adventure to a dungeon such as Dire Maul. You would need to find a tank, you would need to find a healer, and you would need to find your appropriate DPS to team up with. You'd then have to get either everyone to travel to the dungeon, or you would just send 2 people who would then use the summoning stone to summon the rest of the party. You could then share your quests that you might have found along the way. It would save your fellow adventurers time having to search for them themselves. And off you would go. You would do the dungeon, you would use tactics, you would use crowd control, and you would get pride and glory for completing the dungeon, no matter how long it took. These days, though, players don't appreciate dungeons as much as they used to. They don't know really where they're located, and they don't know the story behind it, which is maybe no big deal, but they're in locations, they have stories. It's worth knowing about these. They're in the game for a reason. A lot of players just simply press the Q button and bam, you're in a party with other heirloom clad power junkies, and you're battling to see how fast you can complete the dungeon and get to your next queue. That's essentially what happens. Now, don't get me wrong, I level a lot of characters. I level multiple characters on multiple realms, and the party system is extremely helpful. You don't have to search for hours looking for parties to go to areas. It does allow you to zip from level 15 to level 30 in such a short space of time. And having the quest givers located within the dungeons also is a godsend for a lot of players. Otherwise, a lot of the quests would never get done. You wouldn't go and find them, or if you knew where they were, you probably wouldn't spend the time to go and get them. And even then, if you did get them, you probably wouldn't go hand them back in again. So what would my solution to dungeons be? Well, I don't really think there is one. Dungeons are what they are now, and they're completed in a completely different way. It's a shame, especially as to find parties for mythic dungeons, you've got to go about a similar process as you once would with normal dungeons. It's a consequence of Blizzard's past changes to dungeons, and it's kind of consequentially a similar thing as flying has done to immersion and scale. You can't roll it back without half the player base flipping out and threatening to leave, even if a lot of the time the threats are hollow. The potential saving grace could be a new PvE competitive dungeon of sorts, where groups compete to clear rooms and get loot. The first to the finish wins, but it's maybe not as simple as a speed race. You have to open boxes, kill mobs along the way, each giving you points, much the same way as the Withered Training quest went about it. There's a lot that could be added to that. That's kind of a bare bones solution, but that could pave a way for a whole new way of looking at dungeons, or looking at a PvE dungeon system. Next on the agenda, PvP. Love it or hate it, PvP is part of the game. Battlegrounds, arenas, and open world PvP zones. It's a mode we love to hate and we love to cry about. Well, I especially do. With the now historic death of talent trees and the introduction of the tramline talent progression, PvP can now be a bit of a slow burner and scares a lot of players off, unless you're a hardcore player who's grinding their way through the tramline to get all the abilities unlocked. For anyone competing on a regular basis, the progression will be pretty quick, and you'll have a heady advantage over lesser visited players. And from time to time, whenever I have gone into Battlegrounds, it does seem to be completely one-sided. It's maybe nothing to do with the tramline effect, but I suspect it may have something to do with with the Horde players constantly winning, they're more inclined to go back and continually do PvP, to do battlegrounds, and they progress their tramline talent a lot faster than the Alliance. Players being players are less inclined to join losing games. We're a fickle bunch. We like to win, and we like to feel godlike. It's just human nature. And repeatedly being beaten scares a lot of people off. So the Alliance are always going to lose, especially in my battle group. The Alliance tend to lose 10 out of 10. As with the zones and dungeons, gone are the days where you would get to meet your fellow battleground lovers outside the instance portal, dueling and kind of messing around while you wait for your call to arms. It's a shame because I personally actually did make some good connections there. I still talk to a lot of players I used to talk to back in the day, and I made some in real life friends out of it too. Solutions for PvP. I think the tramline talent effect is actually a good thing. Everyone's on a level playing field, or they're on a level playing field to work towards. I do, however, believe that there is a need for more variation in battlegrounds themselves, including more battlegrounds and areas, more capture the flags, more point defense, and the kind of attack defense invasion like Strand of the Ancient. We need more battlegrounds like Strand of the Ancients. I personally think it's a great battleground. I could even go as far as introducing or suggesting the introduction of a new game type, and this might be sort of Alliance and Horde starting in the same place on a tramline style battleground, side by side, but obviously separated. Each side would man a boat, and once on, the boat would start sailing at the same speed from point A towards point B. All the while, you could man guns and shoot your enemy's ship, and if you every time you shoot it, it slows down. You could potentially repair it, but you could at the same time jump from one ship to the next. And the more people and the more damage that are on the one ship, it goes slower. But as you kill more enemy players, your faction might get a spirit boost, and with the spirit boost, the ship would sail faster. So each side would be battling A on each other's ships, or B firing each other's ships, and they would trying to get from point A to point B as fast as they can. You would get to point B, you would maybe ring a bell, or you would hold a point, and I think that would be quite a cool little style. A second pitch might be one which is already kind of be featured in the game in places like Ashram, where each faction has a boss. The opposing faction needs to both attack and defend the boss, or the enemy's boss. Bosses wouldn't naturally regain health if disengaged, but I suppose you could have your own faction retrieving items and giving them to your boss that would boost them in certain ways. When looking at a balance to the win-lose ratio of battlegrounds, as I say, especially in my battle group where the Horde tends to win 10 out of 10, or at least 9 out of 10, you could potentially introduce a feature which is already in the looking for raid, which is the feature that every time you wipe, you get a buff, and the buff makes it easier to kill the boss. So say for example the Horde win 10 straight battlegrounds, then any Alliance player joining the battleground would receive a buff to rally the troops across each of the battlegrounds, maybe giving them an advantage to health or attack speed, and it just gets better and better for them for every loss they get, thus giving them an advantage towards a win. The buff could be transferable to either faction, so eventually they would encourage more Alliance players. They would get to know what they're doing a bit more, and the Horde players would continue to play to battle as well. By this point, the buff might then not be needed at all, because the amount of people playing and taking part, they would know what they were doing, it would be more competitive, and it would increase the footfall into battlegrounds for a large amount of players, not just PvP players. PvE players would then go in, and it would redress the balance of win to lose. I actually took the time to speak to an in real life friend who used to be a big PvP player about my thoughts on how you could fix PvP and the problems it's got, and these were his kind of thoughts. He said that there was a lot of potential to PvP in Warcraft, but pretty much every class has a heal, a stun, a daze, a gap closer these days. And it's all just different particle effects for the same skill set. If classes are actually unique in their basic mechanics and there was enough variance, you could see a meta shift as players design, refine, and master certain combinations of classes and talents and skills. Then it gains more traction and you'll learn to design and counter other classes' abilities. It then creates a much longer lasting gameplay loop, and it still means that Blizzard don't need to perfectly balance classes and skills, as the players would take care of that themselves. You could then spend time creating interesting gameplay mechanics that add choice to the game rather than spending all their time buffing and nerfing classes to keep people happy. Now, I kind of fully agree with his points there. I think you choose a priest, the priest should have priestly abilities. If you choose a rogue, the rogue should have rogue abilities. You shouldn't then get a crossover where everyone's got a heal or everyone's got a stun or everyone's got a breakout. Classes were classes back in the day, and you chose your class and it had its perks against others, but you always had a counter of sorts. And I think that's been lost or watered down a lot, and it should really be redressed. So lastly, we have quests and consequences. I love a long quest chain. It really helps draw you into the story and it makes you feel part of the story itself. It helps your journey into the game and it helps you feel like you've influenced what's happening around you. But in effect, it's a tramline again. I love that word this time. Tramlines everywhere. But it is true. You're kind of going from point A to point B. You have no real effect on it. There's a lot of fun and interesting quests out there, often in places where you wouldn't expect them to be, off the beaten track, in the middle of a kind of secluded wooded area, or in a cave that's maybe halfway up a mountain or underwater. But these are usually the kind of coolest little quests to go and retrieve something stuck up a tree and then take it somewhere else and do something with it. But sometimes quests seem to be a bit throwaway, and you have to walk from one side of the room or the town, pick up an item and return it. To me, that's not fun. There's not much more I can really say that you don't really know about questing. We all quest, and we all know what questing's about. So solutions for questing, I think quest consequences could be a solution. That's right. Occasionally, it would be worth having a consequence for your actions within a quest, a kind of choice of sorts. So take, for example, when you're leveling an undead character, you are tasked with killing baby Murlocs. Well, I say killing baby Murlocs. You've got to scare them to death. If you look again at what might happen if you had a consequence for your actions. So you're given a choice. You either scare the baby Murlocs to death, resulting in future Murlocs possibly rising up and scaring baby humanoids to death, or you could herd the baby Murlocs and the Murlocs to another site away from the settlement that have asked you to kill them, and maybe the future Murloc generations will remember your kindness, and you could return and find that they've built a settlement and they're working and trading with the neighbouring settlement. They're fishing and trading with them. Quest consequences work in other games. Towns sometimes have the consequence of becoming larger with more of a population upon successful quests done in a certain way. Zones and areas occasionally have the ability to grow greener or die away depending on what your choices are. There's going to be so many choices, so it could be phased for each player, but eventually there's going to be a lot of players with a similar sort of choice. Quest chains would then become more immersive with consequences. There'd be more playability, and you would probably find you'd end up leveling more characters to try and find out what the different consequences are. You'd end up exploring areas a bit more. I just think it'd be a bit more fun and introduce more action and more interaction with zones again and with quests in general. But they're pretty much my ramblings and thoughts about Warcraft as things stand and how things once were to a certain degree. When the new expansion announcement drops and information about it becomes more available, maybe some of these points may be knocked off the list, and Blizzard have possibly thought about a lot of them and have incorporated them. If not, it's potential for future content. As a lifelong player, and I'm currently of that sort of time where I feel like I probably will never stop playing WoW, then I would like to see the game evolve and gain strength and try to draw a lot of my friends that have since stopped playing back into the game, reseed the community feel which has kind of been eroded over years for the sake of accessibility. Yes, my ramblings are a little bit random at times, but if there are any points that you would like to bring up, suggest yourself, as I said at the beginning, please comment below, and potentially I could look at making a future video to discuss your comments or any future thoughts that I might have. So until then, take care and keep gaming.